So nice to meet you all. I'm Brian Keenan, founder of Odyssey. It's really great to have you all here. We're for the Breaking Into Software Engineering panel today. This is our first in a Breaking Into series. We're going to be having with finance, consulting, non-engineering and tech, and other panels, just to give you an idea of what it's like to break into a new industry. And well, we're bringing you 3 awesome professionals for 45 minutes to answer all your questions. I know most of you here are Odyssey members, but there's some that aren't. So I'll give you a brief background on what we do at Odyssey. Basically, I was a first generation college student myself, trying to break into finance, and it was just an awful, overwhelming process. And basically, through 10 degrees of separation and reaching out to 100 different people, I finally found somebody who was able to lend a helping hand and made a big impact on my career trajectory. And it got me thinking there has to be a more systematic way to help facilitate those connections. And there are so many professionals out there that are willing to help, and it's just about providing a platform to help them do that. So on Odyssey, you can book office hours with professionals, where basically professionals come on, they fill out a quick profile, and then they can post 30-minute slots when they're available. And we reach out to you based on your interest to suggest those slots. And around those office hours, we build community, and we do that through events like this. We have resume workshops. We have more events coming up, and that's kind of what we do here. It's free to join. So anybody who's not on, we would love to have you here. So without further ado, we're really excited to have Bob from Facebook, Sam from Apple, and Rebecca from Google, all great people. They're all on the platform, and they're all software engineers here to talk to you today about breaking into the industry. So I'll let each of them do a quick introduction of themselves. I don't know if Rebecca, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I have to give the common Google disclaimer, which is that nothing I say here represents Google's opinions. It's all my own opinions, just to throw that out there. But yeah, I'm Rebecca Sullivan. I work for Google out in Boulder, Colorado. I've been here with Google for about 2 years. I've been working as a backend software engineer for about 4.5 years. I took a really strange path to tech. I did my undergrad. I went to a classical music conservatory for my undergrad. Thought I wanted to be a orchestral musician. Realized I didn't. Then went and got an MBA, business degree for my master's. Worked in marketing for a while after that. Saw what the people next to me were doing in tech when I was working in marketing, and thought it was super cool. So I quit my job. I went through one of those coding boot camps. That was 4.5 years ago. Then I've been working as a software developer ever since. Before Google, I worked for 2 other companies out in Cleveland, Ohio, in the Midwest, which is sort of a different, in my opinion, a different world and a different market from the coasts and from Denver, Boulder as well. So kind of a different experience. But yeah, I'm really, the reason I signed up for Odyssey is I really like to help people break into tech. I wish I was exposed to tech a lot sooner in my career. So glad to be here and to help answer any questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Sam, you want to go next?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Sam. I'm currently a software engineer at Apple. Joined about 5 months ago, halfway during the pandemic. And before that, I was a web developer at Mitsubishi, where I worked on web applications. Before that, I was a college dropout after attempting to start up my own mobile app. So that was a pretty interesting journey. Studied computer engineering at Michigan State. And yeah, it was a pretty unconventional path, I would say. I've always really liked tech growing up. I was actually a decent programmer in high school before coming into college. So I kind of went the hardware route a little bit just to round myself out of it. But these days, I'm very much removed from the hardware. I'm on the Apple Pay team, so I do a lot of back-end engineering. But yeah, like Rebecca said, this would have been like a really nice opportunity had I had it coming up earlier. So I look forward to talking to you guys and hopefully answering a few questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Bob?
Hey guys, my name's Bob. I'm a software engineer at Facebook. I've been there for 3.5 years about. Feels like forever. I come from a background of a sort of working class family, and no one in my life was really around tech at all. And I found myself interested in math. So I was kind of like stuck on the math track. Computer science is sort of like applied math in some ways. And, you know, you hear all these like, oh, the tech is the future sort of riffs and things. So I saw that as like, oh, okay, I'll just pick that as a major. Really buckled down in college and got an internship at DraftKings, and then used that to get an internship at Facebook, and was a peer mentor and a tutor at UMass Amherst. And I find myself here still at Facebook, and it's still kind of amazing that they let me stay. So I work on the Messenger team on video calling. So Zoom's actually, I don't use Zoom very much. It's actually, I guess in theory, our competitors. So this is new for me a bit, but I'm excited to help out. I also wish I was exposed earlier. So happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. And anybody in the audience throughout this whole thing, if you have any questions, feel free to either throw them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can call on you. And basically we're gonna do a round of questions now, but then we'll also be going through what you submitted beforehand. So thank you, Bob. I think the first thing, I think it'd be great if each of you could kind of share how you landed that first software engineering job. So I know Rebecca, it was out of that boot camp, and Sam, you were at, I guess, the web applications at Mitsubishi was the first job after when you were doing your startup. And then how, I guess, Bob, for you, it was that transition from DraftKings to Facebook, and like how you leverage that. So I think if each of you could walk us through that, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, I guess I can just go first. So in between, like, my startup wasn't really like generating like any revenue. By the time like towards the end, I was actually like just losing money trying to maintain the infrastructure. And so I was just working part-time as a server at a restaurant in Grand Rapids. I grew up in Michigan. And so I realized it was going to be hard to just get back into college just because it's so expensive, and I had debt accumulated. So I was like, okay, how can I at least like leverage the skills that I have? Because I still felt like, you know, I was a moderately like decent programmer, right? I should be able to do something. So I just applied all around like my city basically. And eventually, after quite a few rejections, this local company, I worked for like the satellite office of Mitsubishi, right? And so they have like a satellite office in Grand Rapids, and they decided to, you know, interview me and take a chance on me. And it ended up working out, and I enjoyed it for about a year and a half. And yeah, I guess really I just had to sort of persevere. It was like 6 months of just applying and trying to really communicate like what I had done like on my resume. Like I did lots of like technical work like in that startup. So definitely communicating projects or any of that sort of thing goes a long way.
Cool. Bob, you want to go next?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I had interned at DraftKings, which maybe some of you know is a sports daily fantasy sports company that has a lot of tech behind it. And I got that internship because I was an orientation leader at UMass, and the recruiter also was an orientation leader. It was a very like coincidental thing. I mean, I'd been rifling off, you know, applications to dozens of companies and just getting like silence. So I got lucky there for sure. The transition to Facebook was interesting because they often want some experience. And actually in my interview at Facebook, I got, you know, you study for these technical interview questions, and I really leveraged a lot of my students too, or the people I was around at the time, not my students, my peers, I guess. And they were just, I basically was like, how do I even, I didn't even know about the internship world and like how intense it can be to apply. And they were like, I just sort of like hopped on the bandwagon to learn about how to do it all. And then I found myself interviewing at Facebook, and I got the question completely wrong. Like in the first 20 minutes, I solved it and it was like totally wrong. And then the interviewer thought it was right, and I had like a fork. I was like, should I tell him it's wrong or not? And I spent the next half hour like proving to him that it was wrong. And then by the end, he knew it was wrong. And we were like, wow. And then I like left the interview and I was like, what the hell did I just do? Like, why did I do that? but apparently they liked the humility, and I actually connected with the person afterwards, and they were like, that's the kind of person you want to work with, is someone who can like admit when they're wrong. So that has always stuck with me too. But it was a lot of luck, and just like the amount of places you apply and don't hear back from is pretty astounding, and that's just like pretty normal.
I can't imagine the tension in your head. You're already nervous about the interview, and then in the back of your head, you're wondering, do I mention this? Do I not mention this?
Right. Yeah, it was crazy. I felt silly afterwards, but I guess it worked out.
It's a great story. Rebecca.
Yeah, so I've been through 3 job searches in the tech side of things. So the one right out of boot camp, and then I changed jobs, and then the third one was when I came to Google. And I will say that the first one was definitely the hardest. Once you have even like 6 months of experience on your resume, like recruiters start contacting you versus you having to contact recruiters. So it gets a lot easier with subsequent job searches, and even easier the more experience you have. But I think the biggest advice I have is to not get lulled into a sense of security by sending your resume out into the black hole of the internet, because it really doesn't do much. The entire boot camp, I was having coffee with anyone who would talk to me about any job in tech. So taking a perspective of like being genuinely interested in what their job is like, trying to figure out what types of companies or what types of jobs would actually be a good fit for you, whether it's a FANG company like the 3 of us work at, or a smaller company or mid-sized company. There are lots of great opportunities out there. I shamelessly plugged this book that like really helped me through the search, called The 2-Hour Job Search. It's this great approach of like getting out of the internet black hole and into how to have coffee conversations, how to even cold email people like on LinkedIn or email, whatever it might be. And that was hugely successful. You get so many more responses and leads and that kind of thing. So that's definitely my biggest advice. That helped a lot. I was in the Midwest at the time, so the market's a little bit different out there. But just know that in addition to the coast, there are lots of smaller job markets that have a really big need for tech talent. So if you're willing to live in a Denver or an Austin or Boulder or a Atlanta, something like that, like great cities, there are tons of opportunities.
It's funny you mentioned the 2-hour job search. We're actually working to schedule it right now, where we're going to have a workshop with a career advisor from Columbia Business School, and she's going to go, and it's going to be all about the 2-hour job search, the book. And that should be early March, and we'll probably make it a book club book next month. And for any of the students on here, if you can't afford the book, then we'll provide it through our book scholarship. So keep an eye out for that, and it's a great, awesome recommendation. So
nice.
Let's start with some of the questions we've had come through the registration. So one of them, this is a good one, is for beginners, what do you have to know, or what skills do you have to learn to set yourself up for a future in software engineering? So like from the very beginning, what should you be thinking about it?
I think for one, soft skills are really important. It doesn't matter like how technically sound you are. If you can't work in a team, like you'll never succeed. So I'm putting that out there now.
Yeah, +1 to that. Not only just working in a team, but like understanding. I mean, because if you're trying to get a job at a corporation that makes money, you need to understand what you're building and just have some empathy for what you're actually investing time in, and kind of trying to understand that relationship. And of course, beyond that, like algorithms at a basic level, data structures at a basic level, some of your basic programming stuff. But often you don't need to know very much more than that to get started. A lot of things you'll just learn while you're there.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of those points. Someone once told me that soft skills and technical skills are like multipliers. So if you're fantastic technically, but you have nothing going on the soft skills, then you basically cancel out your technical skills, and vice versa. If you're like a smooth talker, but you have no technical skills, like, well, who cares that you can work with people? So yeah, I 100% agree with making sure you're developing both. I think some practical skills too that you don't necessarily get in a formal education setting are just like some of the, skills like testing and debugging and source control, just getting familiar with some of those on whether it's side projects or, deploying code. If you can get like a side project app out into the wild, the like production environment, those are all great things that you'll learn much faster when you have an internship or a job, but it's nice to kind of get your toes wet on some of those.
Awesome. And then say you're a freshman coming in and you haven't done any of the formal training. Is there a specific coding language you would recommend, or a specific resource that you used when you were first kind of immersing yourself in the software engineering world?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if I can pinpoint anything specific, because I think for the most part, I think a lot of companies that you end up joining, they're somewhat aware of like what your curriculum was coming in. So they may or may not like expect you to know like Git source control or like those sorts of things. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe the other two, you guys can have a more specific answer.
Yeah, I have some ideas. I think it really depends on what type of company you're looking for. If you're interviewing for, I can tell you the Google perspective. We're large enough that they will interview you in whatever language you want to interview in, basically, as long as it's one of the common ones. Common ones are Java, JavaScript, Python, Go, C#. Like if it's a major language, they'll find an interviewer for you. My experience interviewing at smaller companies is it kind of depends on the company. Some companies get tied up in wanting you to have experience with a particular or knowledge of a particular stack. And some of them are willing to say, hey, you're an entry-level developer, we'll teach you along the way. And some companies are a little more closed-minded and say, no, you really need to know Ruby on Rails in order to succeed here. So to me, it depends on the size and the size of the company and the company in particular.
Yeah, having come from a university like computer science program straight through, like it was very valuable to just lean into their program, which was Java, which is not a very sexy language these days, but the curriculum was there. And honestly, once you learn a language, picking up others in general is much easier. Of course, some of them are extremely different, but broadly, like learning Python from Java is not so hard. So I'd say just like pick one that whatever training you're thinking of going through, whether it's school or a boot camp or some website, just, lean into whatever their specialty is and just kind of get used to that. Of course, if you're trying to be front end, you might want to be JavaScript, or if you're trying to do iOS or Android, you might want to do Objective-C, Swift, Kotlin, Java, whatever makes sense for that platform.
Yeah, I was going to say, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Piggybacking off Rebecca said, I think location goes into it quite a bit as well, right? Like I grew up in the Midwest, and that's where I started my career basically. I know like in West Michigan, for example, I think this extends to the rest of the Midwest a little bit as well, is that like the .NET ecosystem is more popular, right? For the more like traditional industries, for example. So already knowing like C# and like Microsoft, like Azure's cloud infrastructure, that kind of gave me like a leg up. Whereas now that I live in the Bay Area, I see it's more in the realm of like distributed systems. Java's a lot more common, those sorts of things. So I think definitely having like one mainstream object-oriented programming language under your belt will go a long way. In my interviews, it's usually been Java or C++. So yeah.
Cool. So there's a lot of options, and it seems like a lot of it is depends. So I think in general, it's good to just get started and start learning something, and you can see how much you like it and kind of go from there. I think this next question kind of dovetails kind of well with that, because it's how much value does formal education have towards having a successful software engineering career?
You can imagine that my perspective might be a little biased on this one.
Yeah, I was gonna say we all have different probably stories here, but that's good.
Yeah. So it's funny, I've actually considered going, like, should I go back, and now that I'm at Google and I have some time, should I like try to do a bachelor's or you know, somehow qualify for a master's or something, because there are various programs out there. And the conclusion I keep coming to is that my pace of learning on the job, now that I'm in the door, is fast enough, and the projects are at a scale that's large enough that I can learn like specific targeted skills that are going to help my career at Google. And when I talk to people who decided, other people who are in the same boat who decided to go back to school, their main motivation is, I was just purely interested in the classes and the subject matter, and I was just really interested in having like a broad, generalized foundational knowledge. And the reasons are less, hey, I think this is going to get me promoted at Google. So my conclusion has always been, if I'm going to go double down on something, it's going to be my projects at work, just because I feel like I already learn a lot here. So I don't think you need, like, you definitely need foundational computer science concepts in order to succeed in the interview process and on the job. But for me personally, whether that comes from a bachelor's or a master's degree or from self-learning, I've found self-learning and the combination of that and the boot camp to be sufficient.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to put it. The question itself is kind of multifaceted, right? Because I think you can kind of look at it like long-term and short-term, right? So I think short-term, like formal education will like make it a lot easier, right? Like if I had gotten, you know, continued going through college, I probably could have gotten an internship. I probably could have, you know, entered, you know, maybe a big tech company. I'm not saying that's the ideal place to go for everybody, but maybe I could have like entered at Apple and got there quicker, right? But long term, you know, I still ended up there anyway, right? So I think part of it sort of depends on what's the best way to put this? Like what is available to you at the current moment in time. So I think if I was telling like my brother, for example, like now, I would say, don't stress too much about like, you know, trying to get like a 4.0 GPA at like a top Ivy League school. Like that's like not necessary at all. That's kind of overkill. Just see what you can manage, and usually, you know, a path to forge yourself out in the long run. Yeah, that's probably the best way I would put it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, and to your last point, like leaning into what you're actually interested in, like if you're not really interested in the math behind it or the computer science fundamental like theory, it's probably not worth your time to try and like engineer interest in that. Certainly, yeah, like day to day, I don't think I really think algorithmically all that much. But personally, I was very interested in the math side of things and the theory. And I sort of see being a software engineer as a way to just kind of do that for like a job. But I think my interests lay more in the theoretical space. So it depends, like if you find yourself interested in some of the classes and things you're learning about algorithms and Big O and stuff like that, it's probably a good idea to invest in it. But if it's kind of like you just want to get into the space and work, not really that required. I will say too, as you get more senior in a software engineering career, your altitude gets higher and you're thinking of things more abstractly. And that's where more core fundamental ideas come into play of like re-architecting things and like making huge distributed systems. And you're kind of leaning on knowing a lot of fundamental concepts more, but you can also learn that on the job. It's not like you need to have had a master's or anything to like actually be able to do that.
Cool. So
I do think Sorry.
Go ahead, Sam.
As I hear more, I kind of like think more about it, and I'm able to like add in more thoughts. But what I do think is really cool is sort of the multidisciplinary challenges that are coming up these days. If you look at like the health field, how it's sort of being disrupted by like tech and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of value if you already have a technical background, and so you go back to school to get a degree in like a different field, like say biology or like psychology, right? Like at Apple, human computer interaction is pretty big. Um, so having that sort of background, like you can leverage quite a bit there as well. Um, so I think once, like Rebecca said, once you have the technical foundation, like I'm motivated to go back to school um, to study something I want to study. And if that, turns into something else, that's great as well.
Yeah, I wanted to add too that my answer is colored by the fact that I already spent 6 years going to school. So the idea of then spending another 3 or 4, but if I, had rewound, and I feel like if I had been exposed to some of this stuff and was doing undergrad or a master's degree for the first time, I feel like, yeah, that would be great. I'm just, I'm biased by perhaps the sunk cost fallacy, but.
Makes sense. And I want to say again, if anybody has a question, please raise your hand or feel free to put it in the chat, but I'll keep going through these. And this next one is kind of builds on. So after that, how important is the prestige or pay of your entry-level job to the growth of your career?
I could go, I guess. I think there's a lot of like underlying assumption here about like what someone's goals might be about their career. I think it's like very reasonable to want your career to be optimized for, income growth and compensation increasing over time. And like that's a very reasonable goal to have. I will say that certainly some of the larger companies have, like Facebook, Amazon, they have huge numbers and they're able to pay top market. It's basically a market of software engineers, and some companies are on the higher compensation band and lower one. So certainly like the amount you make, you can use as negotiation for your next job and things like that. But I will say that like you're often able to just switch to other companies and you may take a pay cut or a pay raise based on the kind of company you have. And I think it does matter, but at the same time, you are able to sort of negotiate based on the company's revenue numbers and things like that and your experience in ways that are a little more fluid than you might think.
Oh, okay, I'll go. I saw you unmute yourself and I was like, my bad. But yeah, Bob basically said what I would have said. I think I'll just touch on the prestige part. I think some people might be worried if they try to apply for like one of these like Googles or Facebooks or Apples or whatever, that their like current company might look like smaller or like they won't get any attention. I don't think that's the case at all. There's people from that join these companies and they come from a variety of backgrounds, like company wise. So that part doesn't matter too much. I think what might help is if you're going into like a more specific domain, right? Like for example, I work in Apple Pay. We do look at resumes from like people who are already from the like financial space, like a bit more, or maybe it just might be self-selecting in terms of people who apply to our team. But there are like specific domains that can head you towards a specific trajectory if you're interested in that.
Yeah, I agree that it depends on what your goals are. And for some people, having the prestige of a FANG company name on their resume and the comp package that goes with it, that might be your like number one goal. But I think I wouldn't get too like myopic on this is like the money and the prestige of the name is the only thing that matters to me, because there's so many opportunities and all these other tech companies. Even if you look one rung outside of FANG, really giant tech companies that have great reputations, great cultures, great salaries, all of the above. And another plug for the 2-hour job search. That book is really good at getting you off the finding companies that could be a really good fit for you, that aren't the ones that millions of people are applying to every year, and they're desperate for tech talent. And I also think, life at a company as big as Google, I love working here because of the scale of the projects. Even the smallest bugs affect a lot of people. So it's nice to know that your code is shipping to a pretty large user base. But I will say, from previous companies that I've worked at, sometimes when there's more room for improvement and it's a smaller company, you can have a gigantic impact. So you can come in and with some years of experience and some knowledge, you can make a really huge difference, whether that's at a startup or just a smaller company that's not as mature technically. So I think prestige-wise and salary-wise, there are plenty of opportunities. I think also to keep in mind and in perspective, I think in the tech world, we're really, really privileged with really high salaries. So even if you're not looking at a FANG company, I just think like, oh, what's the country's median income, and what is this company in Cleveland paying me? Oh, that's right, way more than the median income. Okay, maybe I should be grateful for that. So just to keep perspective on, there are lots of great opportunities at companies who would be glad to have you and give you generous salaries.
Awesome. I like putting some perspective into it. I think that's super helpful, and it's easy to get caught up in the whole process, and just taking a step back and looking at how lucky you can be, even if it's not exactly what you're thinking. We just had a question come in.
One thing I want to say there, though, sorry, FANG, I honestly didn't know what FANG meant till like 2 years into my career at Facebook. It's FAANG, and it stands for like the 5. I don't know if they're largest or just, I don't even know why those 5, but Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google as engineering tech companies. I think they are like often grouped together because of their like huge value as companies or something. I don't really know, but that's often like referenced as a set of companies. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Bob. That's a good clarification. Yeah, it would be easy not to know that. And we just had a question come in through the chat, and it's, what is the general process regarding moving up within a company when doing a software engineering role? How do you realistically view your long-term roles and goals at a company? That's a great question.
That's a really good question. Everything pretty much we're saying depends on the company, and certainly we have the FANG view of things. But often a company where engineers are like the main sort of employee, when you think of a tech company where engineers are like the main thing, if you think of something like the New York Times, the journalists are the main thing, even though they might have a good engineering culture. Often there's like a leveling system that is pretty like understood across the industry of like what senior means and what entry level means. And often, your manager works with you to try and behave at the next level and get promoted. And it's often a set of behaviors that change of the scope of thing you're working on. So you gradually start taking things that are harder or more abstract or more vague or larger impact. And your manager helps you do that. And that's one of the main things they should be helping you with. So it is like a gradual thing where you see where your weak spots are. I mean, everyone's bad at some things and good at others. You leverage your skills and what you're good at. Maybe you're really good at communicating, so you leverage that through your career. You pick your job such that, maybe you're working on a product where you're more empathetic towards the users, or maybe you're on an infrastructure team where you're more technical and in the weeds. So you find like a role that makes sense for you, and then you start growing with that team. Of course, you can always move around and move companies and things like that. But if you stay somewhere, you likely work with your manager to start growing as a person and taking on more larger abstract things. And that's generally the direction of how to get promoted and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty sound sentiment. I think the process in engineering can differ from like company to company and individual to individual. Like, I know based on what I've heard around Apple, for example, it's a lot more people oriented. You get rewarded typically for solving people problems. Others in other spaces might look at that as sort of like politics playing a part as well. But that's just one side of like, you know, what historically has garnered people to move up the ladder, right? And that's just the reality of it. Some companies are more based on like a meritocracy. And so there's a lot of like hard numbers looked at towards, or even like any metrics really looked at towards your contributions, your specific contributions. So it just depends. As far as the second part of the question, where I think it was, what does your personal development look like in the future? I think for me personally, when I look at my life as a whole now, it's the first time I've felt like I can kind of stagnate and still be okay for the rest of my life, which kind of warps your thinking a little bit because I was kind of like always like ambitious, but you know, after a long day of solving some really difficult problems, it's just like I kind of don't want to study anymore. I don't really want to read any more books. So I definitely hear the sentiment of like what we call like resting investing kicking in, right? And the vesting comes from the fact that a lot of these companies provide what's called RSU grants or like stock grants, and it takes time for them to vest, right? I guess the equivalent of, for me at like my previous job was just your 401k vesting, but typically at Apple at least you can get a new package every year, right? And so if you just do your meets expectations, you know, at every performance review, which might not be too difficult for a lot of people, you know, you can live quite adequately, and then the drive to go up the ladder diminishes, and that becomes quite common.
Yeah. So speaking a little more to Bob's point about like the scope of your responsibilities and like what level you're thinking at kind of changes over time. So generally at Google, that progression as an entry-level software engineer, you know, people on my team who have just entered as new grads or even as interns or a level in there, you know, typically what their role looks like is, you know, they're implementing with guidance. So something that would take, they're working on projects that have been like scoped out by someone else already. Their work's generally going to take like less than a quarter. They've got sort of like an implementation plan fleshed out. They might be starting to like learn how to write a design doc, that sort of thing. But for the most part, implementation and being independent is their goal. Then as you move up, it turns into, okay, now I can implement independently. I don't really need a lot of hand holding from my team. So you start implementing things that span a quarter or two, and maybe you're writing designs, but with some guidance from more senior people. And then as you get even more senior, it's like, okay, now you're like delegating to other people on the team. You're leading the technical direction of some project or a sub project that fits into the whole. And then as you get higher and higher and higher, it's like now you're responsible for like the entire team's direction and, you know, larger architecture. But to Sam's point, I think there's this really nice expectation that once you get to a certain level, there's no like, okay, well, you've been here for 3 years. Why aren't you being promoted? There's like, no, you can just be a happy individual contributor who's successful for years and years and years. And you don't have to be forced into managing people because it's the only way up. I've seen that happen at other companies. You can just be churning out code and design and working on your projects and kind of a happy camper, I think.
Interesting. So we only have 3 more minutes for our allotted time. So I'll have, maybe I'll sneak in one more question, and then we can wrap it up. But this one is do you enjoy your engineering job? And did you initially believe you were qualified for it? This is a great question to wrap up on.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. We're all excited to answer this question.
Yeah, we had met previously. We were laughing about how we all feel like imposters still. Basically, no. I mean, I think there's times where I feel like I'm like, okay, I kind of know how to program and I can like get through this thing, and I have a sense of the product I work on, but it's like a roller coaster. Like one week I might feel pretty good, and then the next 3 weeks I might feel terrible. I'm like, oh, I'm so bad at everything. Broadly, I think it's kind of everyone struggles with imposter syndrome, or at least a large majority of people do. Certainly you'll meet like overly confident people. But yeah, I think I do enjoy my job. It becomes like a little political at times, and obviously a company has like corporate structure that is frustrating, and but overall, yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. But there are moments where I'm like, geez, I'm faking it.
Yeah, for sure. Again, imposter syndrome is quite rampant. I often joke, and I think I joked with those two earlier. And, I'm curious as to how long it's going to take Apple to realize they made a mistake in hiring me. But in all seriousness, yeah, I mean, you get over it. Like, you just gotta take some time to sort of evaluate yourself and realize that they hired you for a reason, right? And that goes with any role. I currently enjoy my job a decent amount. I enjoyed my role at Mitsubishi as well. And I think overall it's a nice industry to be in. And it's a good time to be in it.
Yeah, I totally agree. For me, when my first job out of boot camp, I felt imposter syndrome. Well, I can't even call it imposter syndrome because I really didn't know anything at all. And I learned a lot of it on the job. But I remember I worked for a company where we had to bill hours. Like I was a developer, but we got farmed out to like external projects. And I remember I'd get so like self-conscious of like, oh, I can't bill the customer these hours because I don't know, like, did I really provide that much value? And I would see my teammates take longer than I did to do a task. And I was like, okay, goodbye imposter syndrome. Like I did that faster so I can build the same hours. So I think like over time, like at first it was pretty scary. And then you start to develop some objective evidence to counter the imposter syndrome thoughts in your head. And you're like, okay, well, if I'm so incompetent, how did that performance review go? Okay. And if I'm so incompetent, how come like I did something someone else didn't know how to do? Like, so you start to kind of document in your head, like counter arguments to the policeman with the flashlight who says, how did you get into Google? So I think it gets better. I have always liked my job. I feel like compared to when I was working in marketing, like my job was really boring and I didn't get a lot of joy out of it. And now I learn something new almost every day in every tech job I've had, which is great.
That's awesome.
I know we're at time, Brian, but I just want to say one more thing on this for advice. When you're starting somewhere, like be honest about that feeling with your manager, with people who are also starting with you. It helps so much to have someone to empathize with, especially this company that maybe is intimidating, and just like be open about it. Everyone has it in their brain and it doesn't help to keep it in. And I've made some really great friends that way at Facebook too.
I love that advice. That's a great advice to end on. And everybody on here, just so you know, I double checked. Bob, Sam, and Rebecca all have an open office hour slot in February if you want to connect and talk more with them. And really, all three of you, thank you so much for this. It was I'm so happy to have had you here, and thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're not on, www.join-odyssey.com, and we look forward to the next event is next Thursday. It's breaking into finance. I know most of the people on here, but we're probably not as interested in that one. But we also have the book club coming up, so just a lot of events, and hope to see you all there.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for having us. Enjoyed it.
Bye, everybody.